This is, of course, about US election. A few months ago, all of us think that maybe Donald Trump will win the presidency. And then technology stocks suffered quite a significant corrections. And then people rotate out to other sectors. But that all reversed in the last 1 month as soon as Kamala Harris entered the race, right? And now people are thinking that maybe Kamala can win because she is quite dominant in many swing states. If I'm not mistaken, 6 from 7 swing states. And Trump is not in a very good position right now. So very briefly, how will this impact growth, inflation, and globalization? Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. I'll start with Jason, please. Thank you.
Great. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. What an honor to be here today to share with our views with you. Thank you, Richie, for the question. I think this is the occasion that I wish I spoke Indonesian so that I can understand a very interesting part of the conference that, that's not no language to me. So going back to the question, right? We all know that the constant or the only constant in politics is change. Trump was leading in the poll, a few weeks ago, not until Harris entered into the race. So what in the end will drive inflation growth or interest rate in the United States, depending on the policy, right? Trump, we all know that physical policy expansion. We all know that Trump has signaled tariff 10% across the board, and maybe up to 60% of tariff from imports, from China into America. What does that mean? That means inflation in the United States might be going up again, given these all policies are driving potentially the inflation up again, right? So under Trump administration, say Trump when he goes into the White House, you probably will see a stronger US dollar. You probably will see inflation gets reflationary again. And you probably will see US rates stay higher for longer. So under that, generally speaking, higher rates, if you will recall, may not be the most positive for equity markets or for bond markets. But that remains to be seen what the tariff play out. Whereas as Harris administration, I think right now you can assume a continuation from what Biden has been doing. So roughly soft landing still the central scenario. We largely will continue to see the capital markets continue to play as it is today.
All right, thank you. And Chilo, do you have anything to add to this question?
Sure, thanks. I thought I would be the last one so that I just do a summary of what the other two gentlemen have said. Now I'm the second one. First of all, let me thank BCA to invite me back again. This is my second time here, and this big room still amazes me. Now, US presidential election, everybody is trying to guess who's going to win. I take a slightly different approach to this issue. No matter who wins, let's see what they are in common in terms of the policy, and then start thinking from here. Then when we get more details about how they implement the policies, then we can position accordingly. Now, from what we know so far, in terms of fiscal policy, both candidates are not fiscal conservatives. So that means they want to prime the economy through different ways. Trump believes tariffs would pay for his fiscal spending, his tax cuts. So that's positive for growth. That is also positive or will boost inflation in the short term. Short term meaning a year after implementation of the policy. And then both of them are sort of protectionist. Oh, before that, Harris wants to pay for the fiscal spending expansion by increasing taxes, especially on corporations and wealthy individuals. So both of them, they want to spend. So good for growth. Inflation will go up a bit, not significantly from where they are, but then there is still the inflationary impact. On global trade, protectionism, deglobalization, both are protectionist. And they have different ways of doing what they want to do to make America great. Trump is more I've used up my English. Isolationist. And he wants to use tariff and everything, focusing more on China than other parts of the world. But Harris, she wants to use more on industrial policies, investment restrictions, and so on. So both kind of policies will accelerate deglobalization, which I think is not very good news for Asia as a region because this region is export-oriented. The last point I want to mention is that if Trump gets into White House and pushes through his high tariff policy, there's an implication on all currencies in the world. There will be currency war again. Because one way to offset the American tariffs to protect your exports is to make your currency cheaper. So there's an implication there that regional currencies or even other global markets currencies, there might be downward pressure if the high tariff policy from Trump becomes reality. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Sakar, what is your take on this?
Salamat siya. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you so much for inviting and hosting us. My quick take on the US elections. Now, obviously, we will have a history perhaps to be made on 4th of November, or Trump might come back as the president. But one thing both the presidents has to go through is the situation related to the fiscal interest payments. Can we have a slide on this? And I just want to explain in a minute what exactly I'm trying to address that. The federal fiscal payments or interest payments is actually currently ruling at all-time high levels. The Fed has decided to cut the interest rates, but as we move forward, if the interest rates are not cut fast quickly, one, will have some implications as regards this burgeoning interest payments as a percentage of GDP. So whatever fiscal policies either of the presidents adopt, it would be having definite impact on how the policies related to growth as well as inflation would be panning out for next few years. They are unable to press too much on the fiscal expenditure, containing some impact and have some impact on the inflation. The second thing you mentioned about globalization. We had some statements coming from President Trump, and further rhetorics would be made till we have elections finally in November. But one thing is sure, there is going to be some changes to the tariff. And tariffs will have implication both on inflationary or deflationary issues in US as well as emerging market where they are sourcing the goods. So far, in the previous Trump regime, we have seen the tariff hike sort of mitigated by currency depreciation. But as we go forward, we will definitely have some implication related to this globalization. Just one small point on globalization, it's not as much globalization as we think because the impact of that has diluted in the last few years. Protectionism, inward-looking economy, stronger democratic statements coming from the leaders, all have some impact on the concept of globalization itself.
Alright, thank you so much. Bapak Ibu, saya izin untuk melakukan translation pertanyaan demi pertanyaan dan saya izin untuk merangkumkan. Jadi pertanyaannya tadi adalah dampak daripada kalau Donald Trump yang jadi presiden dan Kamala Harris yang jadi presiden, dampaknya apa terhadap growth, pertumbuhan ekonomi, terhadap inflasi, terhadap globalisasi. Dan ternyata Bapak Ibu, bedanya nggak terlalu jauh ternyata. Jadi ternyata Donald Trump jelas ya akan memainkan tarif, apalagi ke Tiongkok, tetapi ternyata Kamala Harris juga ternyata proteksionis juga. Jadi ini akan membuat globalisasi ini tanda kutip semakin mundur atau deglobalisasi, dan ini akan membuat inflasi sedikit banyak tuh jadi lebih tinggi juga ternyata Bapak Ibu. Nah walaupun kita lihat inflasi udah mulai turun belakangan, tetapi ternyata potensi dari nanti US election ini ada kemungkinan inflasi ada tekanan walaupun mungkin tidak setinggi sebelumnya Bapak Ibu. Dan yang menarik di sini adalah siapapun yang jadi presiden, hutang Amerika ini ternyata tetap akan tinggi gitu ya. Jadi tetap akan tinggi. Tapi kalau memang nanti Donald Trump yang jadi presiden, dolar mungkin lebih kuat. Kalau Kamala Harris yang jadi presiden, dolar mungkin agak lebih lemah secara relatif dibanding satu sama lain. Nah, tapi kesimpulannya ternyata dua presiden ini bedanya tidak terlalu jauh. Jadi tetap proteksionis dan tetap bisa menciptakan inflasi juga dari kebijakannya. Saya izin untuk move on ke pertanyaan selanjutnya, Bapak Ibu. The next question will be, which asset class will benefit from Trump as compared to Harris? For example, this is just an example, right? For example, if Trump wins the presidency, emerging market will benefit or will not. And then stocks will outperform bonds or not, right? So from asset class and for geographic location as well. Do you want to start first, Sekar? Please.
My take is reasonable simple here. Quickly answering to the question, equities as an asset chart should benefit. But as I explained a few minutes back, it will have to have a major implication derived out of how the currencies will get impacted in the emerging market. The tariff, we are not yet clear how much would be imposed because as I mentioned earlier, in one of the Bloomberg news interviews, perhaps President Trump mentioned about it, we are not only watching what US imports from China, but also from other emerging market economies, particularly on the ASEAN region. Now, if that statement has a weight, and if President Trump comes back, we will have some amount of tariff imposition. Obviously, the Asian countries we have to dwell with as regards how they can tackle the interest rates. If you have seen in the last few months, despite inflation coming down, the respective ASEAN economies are not ready to cut interest rates. Why is that happening? It's a simple type problem most of the central banks are bearing as regards to the Holy Trinity we always talked about. Unless the interest rates will have some implication on the currencies, depreciations against US dollar, they would be reluctant. In the last 4 months at least, we have seen Indonesia hiking up rates in April. Recently, Bank of Japan hiked up interest rates in Japan itself. This is despite inflation easing out or at least under control. We will see this issue impacting the asset class very clearly going forward.
All right, thank you. Jason?
If you really compare Trump and Harris policy differences, right? I would still say that Trump is still more expansionary. So remember that if Trump is going to reduce the tax and then use that money or maybe loosen the regulation for technology companies in the US as well, what does that mean? US stocks will benefit from this physical expansion. The tax reduction will also benefit the wealthy family individual as well as technology company. So you would actually expect equity to do not too bad if Trump is in the White House versus Harris. Although Democratic, they do want some social spending, but mostly that's from the social benefit point of view. For example, social credits, child credits, just to encourage more baby, in the society anymore. So, expansionary-wise, Trump is definitely more than Harris. So, in the White House case, you would expect equity doing not too bad. US technology stocks will continue to benefit from there. And if inflation goes up again because of this expansionary policy, US dollar will be stronger for longer. Harris is on the way again to the soft landing. So largely continue to what we have seen here. But what does that mean? To the second point, I think Richie mentioned, we talk about asset classes. Let's talk about region. If Harris is more of a status quo right now, dollar won't be as strong as it is today. Inflation in the United States will not be as strong as if Trump was in the White House. So largely, capital might be coming back or coming out of US, looking forward to somewhere higher yielding, for example, you know, in Indonesia, the policy rate is 6.5% right now. So maybe in the Harris situation or scenario, emerging markets or non-US assets may perform better than they have performed in the past. So you can see pros and cons here. It's really the policy differences between these two candidates.
Thank you. Chilu?
Well, I tend to take a more holistic view on looking at the asset allocation, broad asset classes. If you look at just between stocks and bonds, and you consider the US economic policy, whoever wins after election, I think right now it's pretty clear that growth is going to be there. So we have growth, positive growth impact. We have some impact on inflation, but inflation won't go up so much as to derail the rate cut cycle. So we still have interest rate cuts. So on that basis, I think in a portfolio, the traditional 60-40 allocation, 60 equities, 40 fixed income, I think that's still a sensible approach to run a portfolio after the election in the US. The policy impact on what sectors, what companies is out of my area of expertise because I'm a macro person. But from what we know in the public domain, Trump is more on deregulation. He is more on technology. He likes even cryptocurrency. So under him, tech sector, defense sector especially, because he's more pro kind of war, so to speak. Tech sector, defense sector, and also the corporate sector overall will benefit. But under Harris, she's more people. So there's going to be more consumer discretionary sectors that will benefit under her kind of policy, healthcare, and so on. So that's how I looked at it. And in terms of regions, we are still positive on the US equities because of the growth aspect, the interest rate cut aspect, and then a spillover effect onto Asia, because Asia is a US dollar block. So whatever easing we see in the US, Asia will benefit. So we are also positive on emerging markets, especially emerging Asia. And last but not least, don't forget about China, because that market has been down for so long, it's worth to look at it again.
Thank you so much. Bapak Ibu, tadi pertanyaannya adalah kalau yang menang Donald Trump atau Kamala Harris, dampaknya apa terhadap aset kelas? Jadi obligasi dibanding dengan saham, pilih yang mana nih? Kemudian dari region lebih baik developed market, negara maju ya, atau emerging market. Nah, tadi jawabannya dari Pak Sekar adalah equity kemungkinan akan outperform bonds, jadi saham akan lebih baik dari obligasi karena ada fiscal spending. Jadi siapapun itu jadi presidenan nanti tetap akan ada fiscal spending yang lumayan gitu ya. Makanya hutang Amerika tadi dikatakan juga tetap akan tinggi Bapak Ibu. Nah kemudian tadi Pak Jason juga menambahkan kalau Trump yang menang itu akan lebih baik buat saham. Karena tadi Pak Cilo juga bilang dia tuh fokusnya deregulasi. Jadi bikin peraturan itu makin longgar, ya berarti perusahaan makin mudah untuk bikin profit gitu ya. Jadi saham itu akan lebih diuntungkan di zamannya Donald Trump dibandingkan dengan Kamala Harris. Nah memang Democratic Party juga mau kasih spending, tapi itu lebih ke arah social spending ya. Jadi belum tentu ada direct impact-nya ke corporate profit gitu Bapak Ibu. Nah kemudian kalau nanti Kamala Harris yang menang, menurut Pak Jason, seperti yang tadi dikatakan, dolar mungkin akan lebih lemah. Jadi itu bagus buat emerging market, Bapak Ibu. Seperti yang kita lihat, rupiah sebulan terakhir menguatnya hampir 1.000 perak gitu ya. Nah itu karena optimisme Kamala Harris mungkin bisa menang nih jadinya. Yang tadi orang pikir Donald Trump pasti menang. Nah tadi Pak Cilo juga menambahkan tetap 60-40 portfolio, artinya 60% di saham, 40% di obligasi, tetap artinya kuncinya di sini adalah diversifikasi, Bapak Ibu. Saya izin lanjut untuk ke pertanyaan selanjutnya. So, the next question will be about the Fed, right? Of course, we have to talk about the Fed because it will drive any asset class there is in the world, right? So, knowing that both Trump and Harris will drive the fiscal deficit even deeper. That means more stimulus, but that means more growth, hopefully, and maybe more inflation ahead, maybe 2 to 3 years from now. Do you think the Fed can cut rates very significantly as expected by the market? Last time I checked, the market expect about 2 percentage point until the next, the end of 2025. Do you think that the Fed can actually go that far, Chilo?
Economically, the quick answer to the question is yes. If there is excessive weakness in the US economy, I believe the Fed will go ahead, keep cutting rates, disregarding what fiscal deficit is. When you look at the fiscal deficit in the US through time, it's been big. It's been there for, what, 20 years, 30 years. It doesn't really obstruct what the monetary policy is being conducted by the Fed. All right? So long term, the deficit's still there, and unless people lose confidence in the US, I don't think the deficit is a major issue for the Fed to run cyclical economic policy. So economically, if there's excessive risk, weakness in the US economy, the Fed will continue to cut rates. The question is about whether the Fed is independent enough. I have no doubt that the Powell Fed will remain independent, because if you remember back in 2018, 2019, Trump basically asked Powell to cut rates. But Powell repeatedly ignored him. And the Fed is basically running monetary policy according to economic needs. So you put the two together, independence of the Fed, economic conditions, if warranted, rate cuts are still there.
Thank you. Jason?
Well, I mean, central bank in theory and in reality, their job, two things, right? Number one, to make sure that labor market is continue full employee. Number two, to make sure that inflation is under control. I guess in the modern days, you started to see central banks also react to market reaction, i.e., I wouldn't say that's more politics driven or politically oriented, but they are also aware what the capital market is saying from our point of view, looking at, for example, a US economy. So from that point of view, I think central bank needs to fulfill its responsibility, which is looking at the dual objective. Number one, full employment. Number one, if inflation is under control, then just do whatever is right for the economy. I think that's a key thing. But don't forget about that. If interest rates in the United States is very high, I guess going back to Rishi's point, US debt to GDP ratio is actually quite high, right? So, I mean, I typically say this, when everyone in the United States goes shopping, people in Asia, we pay the bills through one way or the other. We can buy US Treasury and all that. That's just the bloody truth here. So if you think about that, when interest rates go down, it's actually good for the US Ministry of Finance from the overall debt point of view, because they don't need to pay that high of interest on the debt anymore. So overall, you know, this is something that I tend to think about. Number one, central banks in the modern days, full employment, inflation target, as well as market reaction. I think that's something that central banks are getting more to do. Number two, from the interest rate paying US debt versus Asia point of view, it may not be a bad thing for US to start cut rates too. It's not against the political agenda either. So maybe that's something that we will continue to see unless the tariff, the expansionary physical policy goes too much, then inflation might go up again. That will be the scenario where interest rates may not be cut as fast as we expected.
Thank you so much. Sekar?
My take is in this, the basic assumption, Fed has to be, or rather at least so far has shown an independence towards managing the monetary policy with relation to whatever the US government has done. But I will just circle back on 2 points. From here onwards, the consensus is estimating about 175 basis point, which means 7 cuts starting from this month, 25 basis point each, maybe about till June next year. That's sort of, by and large, consensus getting built. The issue is, can we go further than that? Or there could be more aggressive cuts in terms of 50 basis point on some policy announcements. The key point out here, the reflection of that is dependent on data. Inflation, as well as how the Woj would be impacting the respective price-sensitive issues. Also, since I mentioned, they would be keeping a keen watch on how the interest payment as a percentage of GDP is likely to move, and will definitely have a bearing on what the interest rates are likely to do in the time to come, which obviously is linked to inflation again. So I believe this seems to be, I think, a difficult task or an arduous road ahead, at least in front of whoever be the president come, and will have some implication on the Fed, how fast they cut the rates.
Thank you so much. Pertanyaan saya tanyakan tadi Bapak Ibu adalah, dengan kita tahu fiscal spending ini akan tetap naik, berarti kan dikasih stimulus ya ekonominya. Kalau ekonominya dikasih stimulus, ditambah tarif, proteksionis, berarti inflasi bisa naik. Nah pertanyaannya, bisa nggak The Fed betul-betul cut suku bunga seagresif itu? Karena pasar itu sempat memperkirakan sampai akhir 2025, berarti 1,5 tahun dari sekarang kira-kira suku bunga akan turun kira-kira 2%. Dari sekarang ya 5%-an, sekarang nanti bisa mungkin ke ya 3%-an gitu ya Bapak Ibu. Nah jawabannya ternyata dari para narasumber kita adalah The Fed ini memang kan harusnya independen ya, jadi tidak mengikuti pemerintah. Jadi mereka akan lihat data ekonomi, kalau inflasi turun, ekonomi jelek, ya berarti mereka bisa cut suku bunga lebih agresif. Tapi kalau ternyata ekonominya tetap kuat, kemudian inflasi nanti naik lagi karena ada tarif, karena ada stimulus ekonomi, ya berarti The Fed-nya mungkin tidak bisa cut sebanyak itu. Nah yang menarik yang nanti kita harus perhatikan, menurut para narasumber adalah The Fed akan tetap independen. Nah cuman alasan kenapa saya berikan pertanyaan ini, karena sekitar sebulan lalu Donald Trump mengecam The Fed. Dia mengatakan The Fed tidak boleh cut di bulan September. Kalau The Fed cut September, berarti dia belain Joe Biden, gitu kan? Nah, dan dulu Jerome Powell, kepalanya The Fed sekarang, yang mengangkat dia jadi kepala The Fed adalah Donald Trump. Nah ini yang nanti kita lihat, jadinya beneran nggak Powell akan cut atau tidak gitu ya Bapak Ibu ya. Tapi menurut narasumber, mereka akan tetap sesuai dengan mandatnya, tidak akan terpengaruh oleh politik Bapak Ibu. Nah Bapak Ibu, segmen pertama sudah selesai, saya akan masuk lebih dalam lagi ke market masing-masing ya Bapak Ibu ya. Market Amerika, market China, dan market India. So we'll dig more on the US equities and then China and of course Indian equities as well. So I'll go to Jason. So US equities has been outperforming the international market for maybe about 10 years right now, be it developed market or emerging markets. Do you think this US exceptionalism can still continue after the election? Because we have seen quite some kind of a rotation, be it in the US itself, but as well as rotation from developed market to emerging market as well. Do you think US exceptionalism can still continue after the election, regardless who wins?
Okay. I think the simple answer is yes. And I have 3 reasons just to support this argument. Number one, very clear. From the macroeconomy point of view, the US economy is en route to a soft landing, which means that we are not seeing any imminent recession in the near future. The US macro fundamentals is doing okay. The Federal Reserve is likely to cut rates soon, which means that liquidity will back to the market again, which will support the financial assets. That's the first perspective from the macroeconomic point of view. Number 2, from the structural growth or corporate fundamental point of view, we all know that US has positioned itself very successfully as the global technology leader, particularly in AI as well as anything that supports AI, for example, semiconductor and all that, right? So you can see the chart actually came out at the perfect timing. On the left-hand side, from your point of view, you can see this is the, sorry, I couldn't see that. That's the growth, EPS growth when we compare US versus other region, right? And largely explain why US exceptionalism for 2023 and 2024 is there, because the blue bar, which marks Magnificent Seven, actually stood out so obviously. But when we push the investment time horizon further, you can see even from the S&P 493, NASDAQ, or just S&P overall, it is still quite benign and healthy for the years to come. So that's the second argument that supports the US equity performance, which is more from the structural story point of view, from the corporate fundamental point of view. And on the right-hand side, you can see when the Federal Reserve starts to cut rate, in the historical point of view, if the environment is actually not in a recession, typically quite a lot of upside for US equities too. So that's the second argument. The third argument will be, if you look around globally, right, which market continues to have this dominance or advantage across the board, I think US, for one, will continue to lead the global economy recovery. When we talk about global economy, we typically talk about US as the biggest part. So from the 3 point of view, we think it's very clear that it all supports US equity continue to perform. But one thing I would like to highlight here is that you see that very standing out part of Magnificent Seven in 2023 and 2024. I think largely the shorter term explosive growth onto these technology stocks will revert back to medium, longer term structural stories, which means that you probably wouldn't be able to see a massive outperformance in the short period of time, but then the structural story, the macro fundamental supports, as well as the monetary policy is there intact to support the US equities going forward as more of a structural growth story.
Thank you so much. Bapak Ibu, saya bertanya tentang pasar Amerika yang bisa dibilang merajai pasar saham dunia. Nggak ada pasar yang lebih bagus dari pasar saham Amerika, gitu ya, selama 10 tahun terakhir. Nah, pertanyaan saya tadi ke Pak Jason adalah, apakah ini akan tetap bisa berlanjut? Karena kita udah mau lihat ada rotasi keluar dari Amerika, masuk salah satunya Indonesia ya, IHSG udah all time high, rupiah sangat kuat, dan banyak market lainnya. Nah, jawaban dari Pak Jason adalah, Schroder percaya tetap Amerika ini tetap akan sangat kuat. Karena mau gimana pun teknologi itu paling berkembang di Amerika, ada AI, ada semiconductor, dan banyak hal lainnya. Kemudian dilihat dari laba perusahaan juga memang masih sangat kuat. Dilihat dari pertumbuhan ekonomi Amerika dibandingkan dengan dunia atau negara lain juga masih paling kuat. Dan tadi ada disebut juga, the Fed akan segera memotong suku bunga. Nah ini membuat ibaratnya apa ya, diberi stimulus lebih lah dari segi moneter. Jadi pasarnya ini tetap akan bagus nih saham Amerika ini. Nah cuman saya sangat appreciate Pak Jason ini ngasih tahu juga nih ke Bapak Ibu, ngasih tahu ke kita juga, Magnificent Seven selama ini yang benar-benar mengangkat pasar saham Amerika. Tapi ini yang saya cukup appreciate karena Pak Jason bilang jangan expect nanti ke depannya akan sama seperti yang kita lihat 2-3 tahun terakhir. Karena kemarin ini tadi bahasanya naiknya tuh explosive growth. Nah ke depannya ini akan lebih normal Bapak Ibu. Jadi bisa dikatakan growth 2-3 tahun terakhir di Magnificent Seven ini kenaikan harga sahamnya, baik itu profitnya dan sebagainya, tidak normal, artinya sangat tinggi. Nah ke depannya ini akan mulai normal, bukan berarti jelek, tetapi dari yang sangat tinggi akan masuk ke level yang lebih normal, yang lebih sustainable ke depannya. Gitu ya, dilihat earningsnya masih bagus, fundamental masih bagus. Saya akan lanjutkan ke pertanyaan berikutnya. So the next question will be the de-dollarization. I don't know in Hong Kong, but in Indonesia it's a very hot topic. we can find a WhatsApp message from family, friends, and everyone talking about de-dollarization, saying that dollar will fall very significantly. Can you explain to us about the current state? Do you think dollar will fall significantly in a short term? Thank you.
That's a great question. I mean, the dollarization to us is more of a structural trend, whether that will happen or not. I think in the shorter term, you probably will see US dollar continues to depreciate. But that's largely because of the interest rate differences between US and Asia gets smaller as the Federal Reserve starts to cut rates, right? More from the medium term to longer term point of view, you probably will see more countries using currencies for global trade, for commerce, for whatever the international bilateral trades, more currencies than just US dollars. But whether that means de-dollarization, I think that remains to be discussed. Going back to the point, the point that I mentioned before, right? If US has positioned itself as a leader in the world from the structural technology point of view, for someone to replace the economy or to replace the currency, it takes a lot of efforts. You need an economy that's much stronger than the US economy itself. You need a market or country that may be able to influence more than what the US has been doing, right? So I think in the shorter term, I agree with Richie. You probably will, see dollar depreciating, but that's because of the fundamental differences that US economy is almost reaching the peak. Inflation is going down and continues to go down. And, why, in Asia, I think, or in other words, we probably are also turning our cycle as well. So for the near term, I think this could be quite a useful tool for you guys. This is how we look at US dollar in the shorter term, right? We call that dollar smile. It's like when you smile, right? Dollar smile. So on the two sides of the dollar smile, on the left-hand side, if the US is in recession or global is in recession, then dollar will be stronger because everyone will just flock into the safe haven currency, which is US dollar. Or on the other hand of the smile, if the US economy continues to be strong, then all the capital will be chasing US dollar. In between, that's something where we say, US is not too bad, but it's also not too good. From now on to going forward, you probably will see dollar oscillating between the dollar weakness and the right-hand side of the US dollar strength. This is more likely the path for the shorter term. But for the longer term, I think we need to see a lot more supporting evidence to see whether the dollarization is something that will actually happen. But, nevertheless, there will be more trades conducted or transacted in currency other than just US dollar. I think that's a global trend.
Thank you so much. Bapak Ibu, tadi pertanyaan saya tentang de-dollarisasi. Kita semua pasti pernah ya dapat WhatsApp message yang mengatakan jual dolar Anda sekarang karena dolar akan runtuh gitu ya, bahkan dari tahun lalu. Nah, jadi saya bertanya, apakah betul US dollar ini akan runtuh nih Bapak Ibu? Jawaban dari Pak Jason, in the short term, dolar runtuh enggak, tapi mungkin bisa melemah, tapi karena suku bunga mau turun. Karena suku bunga dia turun, kalau dibanding dengan negara lain, berarti perbedaannya tidak jauh gitu kan, berarti dolar lebih tidak menarik dibanding kalau dia tidak cut suku bunga. Tapi bukan tiba-tiba akan ibaratnya free fall gitu ya Bapak Ibu. Nah, memang fakta bahwa banyak negara, banyak perusahaan yang mau mulai menggunakan mata uang selain dolar dalam perdagangannya, itu juga turut membuat dolar secara medium to long term itu akan lebih lemah gitu ya. Tetapi masalahnya sekarang adalah dolar ini ekonominya kan Amerika lagi bagus Bapak Ibu. Jadi kalau ekonomi tadi dijelaskan dolar smile itu, kalau ekonominya bagus, ya orang pasti mau pegang dolar juga gitu. Kalau ekonomi Amerika bagus, dedolarisasi ya berarti bisa dibilang nggak bisa terlalu cepat seperti yang kita pikirkan. Tapi kalau Amerika tiba-tiba sangat lemah, ya mungkin orang akan lebih cepat meninggalkan US dollar. Nah, jadi kira-kira kesimpulan seperti itu, dedolarisasi dalam jangka pendek memang untuk jangka menengah ke panjang masih harus dilihat. Benar nggak akan dedolarisasi? Belum ada jawabannya. Tapi untuk short term, memang dolar akan agak lemah karena akan ada pemotongan suku bunga. Nah, sekarang saya izin lanjut ke China market. So we'll be continuing to Chinese market. So China is arguably the one who suffer most in all this geopolitical tension, especially from US, Europe, and so on and so forth. And when the external growth, the source of external growth is not helping, the domestic side of it is also struggling, right? The weak consumer, the weak consumer confidence, and people has been doing this consumption downgrading instead of upgrading. What is the real problem with China? Do they have the money to spend? And if yes, why not spend it? Thank you.
I guess it is the part where the title of this conference, Battle of the Superpower, comes in. I'm just wondering why we can't be friends of the superpower. So my part is to talk about China. If you could just pull up the China chart with all these meters, I'll use it soon. Now, the question about China growth, lack of confidence, insufficient consumer spending, and so on, we all know about it. The key to hurting this consumer confidence is, of course, the property market, because it's so big. It has such a big multiplier effect on the economy. So when the property market is not well, which is not well, then consumer is not well, and the economy is not well. The final question is, can the government do something about it? And if the government can do something about it, what can it be done about it? So that is the crux of the question that Richie asks. Can China do something about it? Is Beijing still having other things in the toolkit? My answer is yes. But the true question is, why is the Chinese government not aggressive enough to push the economy? So to answer that, which will answer all the questions subsequently about spending, consumer consumption, and so on, we have to understand what's in the mind of the central bank, basically the monetary policy, which has been easing. But I've been arguing for 3 years that the easing we've seen over the past 3 years is not sufficient. And to understand that, we have to see into the central bank's mind. And this is my understanding, this slide here. You look at all these different meters, these dials. On your left-hand side, I think the top one, when Chinese growth is strong, yes, when China's growth is weak, there will be strong policy stimulus come up. Weak, by our understanding, is GDP growth rate less than 5%, significantly less than 5%, or even less than 4%, we should see more aggressive easing. And then to the far right, on the top, when the economy is strong, when it's growing significantly above 5%, the central bank will start tightening up because it doesn't want to see the economy to be too strong. And in the middle, when growth is moderate, around 5 to 6%, central bank policy in China, overall macro policy in China is neutral. So these seem quite clear. Problem is what I described in the lower half of this slide, that China currently, the system is in kind of a muddling through state, that you have growth, 5% or so, but then the growth momentum is weakening, which on an ongoing basis gives people a concern about growth not being sustainable. Now that concerns the central bank, that concerns the government, and they also put in stimulus measures to sustain growth at around 5%. The trouble is that they are not aggressive. They just want to see growth being moderate at around 5%. The question is, why? Why China doesn't want stronger growth as it was before? Because growth is not the primary policy goal anymore. There are two primary policy goals in the Chinese authorities' mind that they want to pursue. Growth is secondary. The primary, first, is debt reduction. Second, structural rebalancing. So when they pursue in all efforts these two primary policy goals, it's by default deflationary. There's a drag on growth in the medium term. And the central bank's job is to ease enough to sustain growth so that it won't fall too far. So this is the difficulty that the Chinese authorities today is facing. So when you ask me, is there anything that the Chinese authorities can do to pop up growth? Yes, they can, and they have to ease more aggressively, which even at this point, I think is not enough.
Thank you so much. Bapak Ibu, tadi saya bertanya tentang China atau Tiongkok. Kalau kita lihat ini kan lagi banyak lawannya ya, semua orang nge-ban, semua orang kasih tarif. Kalau barang-barang dari China, berarti eksternal, sumber pertumbuhan eksternalnya ketutup. Tapi di internalnya domestic consumption yang tadi ya kuat sekali juga lagi lemah sekali. Nah pertanyaannya kenapa? Apakah orang China ini nggak punya uang? Atau kalau punya uang kenapa nggak mau konsumsi gitu ya? Nah, jadi problemnya di sini secara singkat saya tadi mendengar penjelasannya memang karena properti Bapak Ibu, krisis properti. Nah, orang Tiongkok ini menaruh kekayaannya kalau nggak salah sekitar 70% atau lebih di properti. Jadi pas properti market hancur, mereka nggak berani spending, padahal uangnya ada. Nah, pertanyaan pemerintah kenapa kok nggak mau kasih stimulus yang sangat agresif supaya ekonominya bisa naik? Jawabannya tadi karena prioritas utama dari Tiongkok bukan lagi pertumbuhan ekonomi yang tinggi, tetapi hutang yang dikurangin. Nah kita tahu 20-30 tahun terakhir Tiongkok pertumbuhannya luar biasa, tapi hutangnya juga luar biasa dan ini titik di mana pemerintahnya lebih mementingkan menjaga level hutang yang lebih aman, tetapi pertumbuhan itu nggak usah terlalu ngebut juga nggak apa-apa. Nah itu yang membuat China ini sekarang jadi tanda kutip beda sama yang dulu ya. Dulu ya pertumbuhan ekonomi paling kenceng ya pasti China. Sekarang mindsetnya sudah berbeda. Okay, I will continue to the next question about China. Many investors think that China is not investable anymore. But I also saw a few huge investors, respectable investors that still put their money in China in quite a significant amount. So what do you think will happen with China market in the future? Because fundamentals is not that bad actually. Valuation is very cheap, but the sentiment is very, very bad. What do you think about China's market in the future? Thank you.
Very simple. In the future, the Chinese market is still investable. Tell me who is now not negative on China. Right? There's no hands raised, either because you are really negative on China or you're too shy. My look at it is summarized in the next slide in China, if you can pull it up, please, that a lot of the investors have confused China's problem today and call China not investable anymore. They have confused the cyclical problems of China, which I described just now, insufficient consumption, property market down cycle, insufficient policy easing. These are all cyclical. You know, they go away. It's easily fixable. With structural issues in China. Now, China faces a lot of structural headwinds. The key three structural issues that people worry about China, I'm going to give you a different angle to look at it. So you think China is not investable because it has an aging population, declining workforce, it has declining productivity, and also it has excess capacity problem, excessive investment. That is only part of the story. First, on the demographics. If you take the numbers, China's population is aging, but it is not an imminent problem as the media would want you to believe. It's, according to my calculation, a 15, probably 20-year problem down the road, which means that there is a decade and a half that policy changes can help influence the future demographic trends or issues in China. Simply, if you take the numbers, you know, we have the research, let us know, we'll send you our report. In the next 15 years, China can easily find more than 400 million workers to offset the expected decline in the working force. We're not talking about increase in birth rate. We're talking about the existing population demographics. So population is not a binding constraint on growth in the short term, medium term. Second, the capital issue. You look at this chart that I have on your left-hand side. This is hard data. As compared to many Asian peers, and other markets, China's capital per worker is still very low. So that means there's still room for investment, for capital accumulation in China. How does that square with the excess capacity, excess investment that you've heard and read about? Well, that's true too. But that excess investment, with the inefficiency that it comes with, is focused on the state sectors, the big state companies, which the Chinese government is trying to change, structural reforms. Right? The other part of the Chinese system is underinvestment by the productive sectors, the private sectors, and so on. So capital, the problem of capital in China is not one of excess capital, but is one of capital misallocation. So structural rebalancing is trying to address that. So the capital factor, again, from my perspective here, is not necessarily a binding constraint on future growth potential. Last but not least, productivity. I think that's the easiest one to address. With heavy investment in developing the tech sector, AI, and so on, Chinese productivity is going to increase again. So when you have the three factors of production, labor, capital, productivity, not binding constraint for the next 10 years, 15 years, maybe even 20 years, China is still investable. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ya, jadi pertanyaan saya tadi Bapak Ibu adalah kenapa banyak investor yang mengatakan China ini sudah tidak bisa diinvestasikan lagi nih. Kita udah harus keluar, China udah nggak ada prospek. Nah, pertanyaan saya ke Pak Cilo, apakah betul dan ke depannya itu apakah tanda kutip market China ini akan udah nggak ada penghuninya, nggak ada investornya? Nah, menurut beliau tidak, karena alasan yang ada 3 alasan gitu ya. Tapi salah satunya banyak orang berpikir, oh orang China katanya sudah aging population, udah nggak produktif nih, udah nggak mau punya anak, jadinya udah China ekonominya udah nggak sebagus dulu. Nah tapi menurut Pak Cilo tadi ada research mengatakan sebenarnya kalau pemerintahnya mau itu bisa di-solve dengan sangat cepat gitu ya. Nggak cepat sih 15-20 tahun gitu ya, demographic issue itu akan tersolve gitu. Tapi kelihatannya itu bukan rencana dari pemerintahnya. Nah kemudian yang tadi menarik, ini agak teori ekonomi, dari segi investasi Bapak Ibu. Jadi China ini kalau dulu yang penting konsumsi banyak, sekarang enggak. Sekarang dia memang fokus ke teknologi, ke R&D gitu ya. Dan tadi lihat capital per worker-nya masih rendah, artinya sebenarnya investasi di China itu untuk meningkatkan produktivitas itu masih ada sebenarnya. Dan menurut Pak Cilo selama tadi capital labor productivity itu ada, pertumbuhan ekonomi akan masih bagus. Dan kalau pertumbuhan ekonomi masih bagus ya berarti perusahaan juga masih bisa make profit. Dan itu kenapa alasannya China itu tetap investable. Walaupun memang banyak sekali sentimen yang nggak baik ya dari segi resiko geopolitiknya. Ada perang dari US, perang tarif dan sebagainya. Nah Bapak Ibu saya izin lanjutkan ke segmen terakhir yaitu India. Shekhar will be discussing about Indian market. So many media headlines say that India will replace China. They never mention when, but first of all, do you think India can actually replace China for the next 5 to 10 years? Thank you.
Replacement is a very strong word, but let me highlight it in this way. China is obviously much bigger in size than India. In terms of the differences, very clearly, one is democratically ruled state, other is not democratically ruled. Cultures are different. There is one language spoken across China, but there are more than 30 languages spoken within India. So it's like a 30 country within one country. Cultures are different, habits are different, languages are different. So India is very different in comparison to various states. But there are a lot of similarities, true, in terms of what we go back to history. But let me just quickly answer the question which you are having. India's per capita income is about 2,700, 2,800 US dollars. This is what China was in 2007-8. Today, China is about 12,000 odd US dollars per capita. In the last 15 years, China has grown with a CAGR of close to about 16-17%. The key question is, India with a population of 1.4 billion, young and hungry, 27 years of average age, can follow China's trend. I'm not saying that sort of similar growth patterns would be formed, but it would be one way in terms of stronger growth. That's what very clear. Second is, we need to look at, for stock market returns, one key important thing in terms of corporate balance sheets. Indian corporate balance sheet, they had their own extravagant bloating of the balance sheets did somewhere in the noughties. China is going through its own correction in the balance sheet management today. India's corporate balance sheet is spick and span. And I can assure you it's one of the best across emerging markets in terms of debt to equity, debt service coverage rate, or whichever you want to take it. So what my point here is, there is a huge demand requirement currently happening. For Indian corporates to expand capacities, they can use their internal accruals, but they can also expand balance sheet using leverage without impacting the profitability. That is the reason the ROEs in the Indian companies in the last 4 years has gone only one way up, whereas some other economies is struggled. Third thing, there are some structural stories in India which gives me a lot of confidence that the runway of growth is longer. It's going to be much stronger as we walk ahead. And more importantly, if we have this political stability which we have witnessed in terms of reforms path being laid down, I believe the next 2 decades, you will find extremely interesting business models evolving in India, and it will continue to invite investors' attention. One last point I just wanted to highlight out here. If you look at 6 years back, India's representation in any of the global or emerging market indices was somewhere about 8-9%. So for an emerging market investor sitting in US or maybe somewhere in Europe, India could have been an outlier market and it can be ignored. But today, it is 20% of MSCI. Now that's significant. One, emerging market investors cannot ignore India anymore. If you look at this chart, this is the progression of India in terms of representation in the MSCI indices. So we are seeing significant flows happening, FDIs as well as FPI, which is foreigners investing into the country. But more clear and the stronger story is the domestic guys investing into various asset classes in India.
Thank you so much. Bapak Ibu, tadi pertanyaan saya ke Pak Sekar adalah India digodong-godong akan menjadi the next China, akan menggantikan China. Pertanyaannya apakah betul? Nah, Pak Sekar ini bilang India itu berbeda dengan China. Dari culture-nya, dari bahasanya, dari semuanya, walaupun demografi sekarang memang juga banyak ya. Tapi secara simpel bisa dikatakan India itu mirip seperti China mungkin sekitar 20 tahun yang lalu. Jadi demografiknya masih ibaratnya masih muda-muda, waktu itu jumlah hutang juga belum terlalu tinggi. Artinya ekonomi India ini punya ruang untuk bisa tanda kutip mendongkrak ekonominya dengan hutang. Ya kita tahu semua negara pasti menggunakan hutang untuk mendongkrak ekonominya. Nah itu yang dilakukan China dan India masih punya ruang untuk itu. Gitu Bapak Ibu. Dan kalau dilihat juga India adalah memang fokus ke domestic market juga. Kalau China sekarang problemnya dia udah jadi pabrik dunia, nggak banyak yang mau beli barangnya. India belum jadi pabrik dunia, baru mau mulai. Tapi dari domestic story-nya itu pun udah sebenarnya sangat luar biasa gitu ya, dengan populasi yang begitu banyak dan demografi yang muda dan orang mulai tambah punya uang di India, ini jadi sangat menarik sekali bagi investor. Namun stabilitas politik ini sangat-sangat penting. Kalau stabilitas politiknya nanti bisa ada terus, India ini akan sangat-sangat menarik, tetapi kalau stabilitas politiknya tiba-tiba bergejolak, maka bisnis model yang ada selama 10 tahun terakhir ini atau 10 tahun ke depan itu akan sangat berbeda. Dan tadi terakhir sangat menarik datanya, India itu dulu di MSCI Emerging Market itu cuman sekitar 9% Bapak Ibu, sekarang 20%. Jadi orang nggak bisa lagi bilang saya nggak mau pelajarin India terlalu banyak, karena India porsinya sudah besar sekali sekarang. Nah kira-kira itu, dan saya akan lanjutkan pertanyaan terakhir untuk Sekar. Please share with us what are the investment opportunities in India, because we talk a lot about US, about China. Can you share with us what is the promising sectors maybe in India? Thank you.
Yeah. Let me just try to club it into 3 or 4 segments out here. And we see very interesting opportunities in each of these segments. The first and foremost is how India has traversed her digitalization adoption path. In the last 10 odd years, Indian government has helped open close to about 500 bank accounts. Opening of bank account is one thing, but getting the banking or the payment gateway all the way on your fingertips was done through increased penetration on the mobile phone. So these two actually formed a very potent combination in terms of how digital adoption has happened. And it is playing through various segments of the economy, particularly banking and other payment gateways. The second thing I just want to highlight is about the consumption. India has 1.4 billion population. As I mentioned some time back, young population, about 27 years of median age. But more importantly, how these young persons think, act, and how they invest or save. This young population is actually saving less, investing more, and consuming more. Let me give you 2 quick examples to highlight how Indians' young population is changing the consumption dynamics in India. Whenever the per capita increases, the first impact has to be the discretion portion of consumption significantly increases, which means people travel more, spend on hotels, attires, something like that. So let me give you quickly one example to highlight this. We have His Holiness Pope in the town, right? Any idea how many people visit his home place, which is Vatican City, every year? It's about 9 to 9 million people visit Vatican City every year in the form of either tourism or spiritual tourism or religious tourism. Mecca, which is the holy place for Muslims, you know how many people visit Mecca every year? About 25 million. Why I'm telling you this data? In India, in the month of January, there was a temple built. It is built on a town which was a sleepy 5,000-year-old history. That temple, after built up, is likely to invite about 50 million tourists, some religious, some just to visit this year. Now, why tourism is so important and what it does? This sleepy town suddenly has a swanky new airport, a new railway station. The real estate prices around the city has gone up significantly. People employment has gone up. And travel to this place has significantly increased. Hotel prices have zoomed like crazy around that area, which means consumption has significantly India. Like this, Indian government has identified about 30 hotspots and promoting tourism. So that gives a huge runway of growth as regards how consumption is going to increase and actually has increased, and we will see in various subsegments. The second quick example I wanted to highlight, and I believe all of us here sitting out here has some way either seen it. I believe there is a Netflix program quite common out here on the Indian matchmaking. As I mentioned, India has a young population. You know, how many marriages or weddings happen in India every year? The number is about 9 to 10 million. I hail from Hong Kong. Hong Kong's population is 7.5 million. It's like Hong Kong getting married every year. Entire Hong Kong. And year after year, because the runway is quite long. What it does is, we try to just understand the ecosystem of this whole marriage, because MSCI doesn't categorize wedding as a segment in India. This particular segment is close to about $160 billion in terms of size. That's a huge number. It is bigger than the automobile industry of India. Now, when we try to figure out various investment opportunity, for example, jewelry, attire, shoes, event management, matchmaking, most of the current establishments are in the unorganized sector. They are getting into organized sector. Companies will come for listing, and we will see better economic models arriving through these companies. So this is a significant change which we have seen in the last few years. Quickly, just one point I want to highlight on the manufacturing. This is a new trend, but government policies are helping and aiding somewhat sort of aping or following what China has done in the last 20, 30 years. Apple, for example, is a recent example. 4 years back, Apple's exports out of India, Apple India I'm talking about, was minuscule. Today, Apple is exporting about 15 billion US dollars out of India. In 1 week's time, we all are aware, Apple iPhone 16 would be launched. I can assure you, if you buy, there would be a made in India tag in that. Almost all the Apple iPhone 16 is going to be manufactured out of India. Now that's a huge change in terms of Apple's P&L and Apple parents I'm talking about, in Apple India's contribution. We have Samsung, we have ABB, Siemens, Timken, all these companies, order book has significantly seen the growth, purely because manufacturing has seen. So just to wrap it up, digitization, clearly I see, consumption boom, and finally maybe manufacturing related, this is the new theme.
Thank you so much. Bapak Ibu tadi saya bertanya apa aja sih memang yang menarik di India gitu bagi investor. Nah tadi tentang digitalisasi, consumer sama manufacturing. Jadi median age di India itu 27 Bapak Ibu. Jadi 1,4 miliar orang itu nilai tangannya umurnya di 27 berarti muda. Dan sekarang mereka itu invest lebih dan konsumsi lebih juga. Jadi udah invest dan konsumsinya juga kuat gitu. Dan mereka ini juga discretionary spendingnya sangat kuat, jadi travelingnya kuat, weddingnya juga bagus, makan di luar, experience dan sebagainya. Jadi ini semua di dalam India sendiri gitu ya. Dan dalam setahun India itu ada 9 sampai 10 juta orang yang menikah. Nah tadi ada bercandaan di Hong Kong total manusia itu cuma 7,5 juta. Jadi tiap tahun kayak Hong Kong semua orang di Hong Kong married lagi gitu tiap tahun katanya gitu ya. Nah kemudian yang tentang berlian ya, jewelry itu juga luar biasa demand-nya. Dan yang terakhir tentang manufacturing. iPhone itu nanti mulai iPhone 16 katanya akan made in India katanya Bapak Ibu. Jadi Apple itu juga udah masuk ke India. Jadi India ini memang adalah market yang sangat menarik.